Section 7 of A Year Amongst the Persians by Edward Granville Browne. A Year Amongst the Persians by Edward Granville Browne. Chapter 4. From Tabriz to Teheran. We have a horror for uncouth monsters, but upon experience all these bugs grow familiar and easy to us. Less strange. On Monday, 7th of November, bidding farewell to our kind host, we quitted Tabriz as we had entered it, with Farach's animals, which we had decided to re-engage at 65 krans a head, nearly £2 sterling, for our journey to the capital. Contrary to the general rule, we managed to begin our journey with a good long stage of 8 farsakhs. We passed nothing of interest except a large sheet of water lying to the north of the road, on which were multitudes of waterfowl. And, as we had made a late start, it was more than an hour after sundown when we reached Haji Aqqa, where we halted for the night. Next day we were joined on the road by a horseman of respectable appearance, who accompanied us on our journey as far as Miyane. His name, as I discovered, was Mirza Hashim, and his conversation did much to beguile the tediousness of the way. Approaching the subject with some diffidence, I asked him to tell me what he knew about the Bahá'í insurrection at Zanjan. He answered that he could not tell me much about it, except that the insurgents, whose numbers hardly exceeded 300 fighting men, held at bay an army of nearly 10,000 men for 9 months. He added that he had himself known one of them who had succeeded in effecting his escape after the sack of the town, and who used to boast that he had with his own hand slain 1,000 of the royal troops. In the course of the morning we passed a fine-looking, though somewhat ruined building, situated on the left side of the road, opposite to the village of Dikine-Tash, which our companion informed us was a palace built for the Shah nearly 40 years ago, on the occasion of his visiting this part of his dominions. Since then it has remained unused, and has been allowed to fall into disrepair. Another neglected palace of this sort exists farther east, at Sultaniyye. Farther on we passed 2 fine old caravanserais, constructed with the care and solidity which characterise all the work done in the glorious days of the Safavi kings. These, however, we passed without halting, and pushed on to Kara Chiman, a picturesquely situated village lying somewhat to the south of the main road, in a little valley through which runs a river bordered with groves of poplar trees. Here we obtained very good quarters in a clean, well-constructed balakhane, upper room, commanding a fine view of the valley, river and village. Next morning, 9th of November, we passed, soon after starting, 2 large villages situated at some distance from the road, the one to the north, the other to the south. The former is called Bashsiz, the latter Bulghawar. Beyond these there was little worthy of note in the parched up, undulating country through which our road lay, until about 3 p.m. we reached our halting place, Sumah, where we obtained good quarters at the house of one Mashhadi Hasan. In the evening we received a visit from our travelling companion Mirza Hashim, and as our next stage would bring us to Miyane, which enjoys so evil a reputation by reason of the poisonous bugs which infest it, we asked him whether it was true, as is currently reported, that the bite of these animals proves fatal to a stranger. After assuring us that this was sometimes the case, he informed us that the so-called Miyane bug, or mala, was not altogether confined to that town, but that it also occurred in Sumah, the village wherein we then were. The villagers, he added, have the following curious story about its origin. Once upon a time, a native of Sumah went to the neighbouring village of Hashtarud, where he became involved in a quarrel with the inhabitants, which culminated in his being murdered by them. From the body of the murdered man emerged a number of these malas, which established themselves in the village of Sumah. Whenever a native of Hashtarud arrives there, they remember the blood feud which exists, and avenge the death of their ancestor by inflicting a fatal bite upon the descendant of his murderers. To all others, however, their bite, though painful, is comparatively harmless. Mirza Hashim then told us of the severity of the winters at Ardabil, and showed us a woolen cap with coverings for the ears admirably adapted for a protection against severe cold. Having informed me that he had refused to sell it for 15 krons, rather less than 10 shillings, he offered to make me a present of it. Of course, I politely declined his offer, telling him that I could not consent to deprive him of so valuable a possession, for I had no need of the cap, and did not think it worth the sum he had mentioned. Europeans travelling in Persia have sometimes complained of what they regard as the meanness of the Persians in offering presents in return for which they expect money. It appears to me that this complaint arises from a failure to understand the fact that such an offer from a man of distinctly lower rank than oneself is merely tantamount to a declaration that he is willing to sell or exchange the article in question. When he offers to give it as a present, he merely uses the same figure of speech as did Ephron the Hittite in negotiating the sale of the cave of Machpelah with Abraham. All peoples make use, to a greater or less extent, of similar euphemisms, and we have no more right to blame a poor Persian for offering us a present, in return for which he expects to receive equivalent value, than to censure as sordid the desire expressed by a cabman to be remembered by us. As I have touched on this subject, I may as well say something about presents in general. There are not fewer than 8 words more or less commonly used in Persian in this sense. Of these, 3, viz. Armaghan, Rah-Avard, and Sargat, signify any object which one brings back from a journey to give to one's friends at home. Yadigar is a keepsake to remind the owner of the absent friend by whom it was given. Hadiyeh is a general term for any sort of present. There remain the terms ta'aruf, pishkesh, and in'am, each of which requires a somewhat fuller explanation. The first of these signifies a present given to someone of about the same social rank as the donor. In such cases, no return is usually expected, at any rate in money. Sometimes, however, the term is used by one who, while desirous of receiving the monetary equivalent of that which he offers, does not wish to admit his social inferiority to the person to whom the present is offered, by using the term pishkesh. When, however, a peasant, servant, muleteer, gardener, or the like, offers a present of flowers, fruits, or fowls to the traveller, he calls it a pishkesh, offering, and for such he generally expects at least the proper value in money of the article so offered. When the present is something to which a definite monetary value can be assigned, e.g. an article of food, this is only right and proper. To expect a poor villager to supply travellers gratis with the necessaries of life, which he can often ill spare, and to blame him for desiring to receive the value of the same, is surely the height of absurdity. With presents of flowers the case is somewhat different. It often happens that the traveller, on visiting a garden for instance, is confronted on his exit by a row of gardeners, each of whom offers him a bunch of flowers. He is then placed in rather a dilemma, for on the one hand he feels some delicacy in refusing what may, after all, be a gift prompted solely by courtesy and kindness, while on the other hand he may not care to pay several krons for that which is of no use to him. Even in this case, I think that Europeans are partly to blame for a custom which has, in some of the more frequented parts of Persia, become an intolerable nuisance. My reason for believing that what sometimes amounts to little less than a system of extortion, theoretically capable of unlimited expansion, so long as there is a handful of flowers in the village and a peasant to bring and offer the same, originally grew out of a graceful and courteous custom of welcoming a stranger by presenting him with a nosegay, is that in parts of Persia less frequently visited by Europeans, such as the neighbourhood of Yezd or Kirman, I have often been given a handful of roses or other flowers by a passing peasant, who continued on his way after the accomplishment of this little act of courtesy, without once pausing or looking back in expectation of receiving a reward. As regards the last kind of present, the in'am, or gratuity, it is, as its name implies, one bestowed by a superior on an inferior, and is almost always given in the form of money. The term is applied not only to the presents of money spoken of above, but to the gratuities given to villagers in whose houses one puts up for the night, keepers of caravanserais, and post-houses at which one alights, shagird chapars, who accompany one on each stage in posting to show the way and bring back the horses, servants in houses at which one stays, and in short anyone of humble rank who renders one a service. To determine the amount which ought to be given in any particular case is sometimes rather a difficult matter for the traveller. A reliable native servant is of great use in this matter, and should the traveller possess such, he will do well to follow his advice until he is able to judge for himself. The most costly in alms, and those which one is most inclined to grudge, are such as must occasionally be given to the farashes of a governor or other great man, who are sent to bear a present from their master, or to meet the traveller and form his escort. To these I shall have occasion to allude again. I must now return from this digression to our march of the 10th of November. The day was cloudy and overcast, and soon after we had started, a gentle rain began to fall. We crossed the river Kizil Uzan in several places, and for a considerable distance wended our way along its broad, gravelly bed. Traversing the crest of a hill soon after midday, we came in full view of the little town of Miyane, which looked very pretty with its blue domes and background of poplars and willows. We had no sooner reached the outskirts of the town than we were met by a number of the inhabitants, each eager to induce us to take up our quarters at his house, the advantages of which he loudly proclaimed. No sooner had we alighted at one place to examine the quarters offered, than all the competitors of its owner cried out with one accord that if we put up there we should assuredly suffer from the bite of the poisonous bugs, with which, they averred, the house in question swarmed. We accordingly moved on to another house, where the same scene was repeated, each man representing his own house as the one place in the town free from this pest, and everyone except the owner uniting in the condemnation of any quarters which we seemed likely to select. Finally, in despair, we selected the first clean-looking room which presented itself, and occupied it, regardless of the warnings of the disappointed competitors, who at length departed, assuring us that we had pitched on one of the very worst houses in the whole town. Soon after our arrival we took a walk through the town and visited the tolerably good bazaars, in which we purchased some dried figs and a fruit called idar, or in Turkish khunab, somewhat resembling a small date with a very large stone, and the imamzade, of which the blue dome is the most conspicuous feature of Miyane. Here, as it was Thursday evening, Shabi Jum'ah, the eve of Friday, many people were assembled to witness a ta'ziyah, or representation of the sufferings of the Imams Hassan and Hussein. In the enclosure surrounding the building was seated a half-naked man, who held in his hand a scourge armed with iron thongs, wherewith he occasionally struck himself on the shoulders and back. All those who entered this enclosure, from which we were excluded, kissed the chains which hung in festoons across the gate. On returning to our quarters, we found a man who had brought his horse to consult us about its eye, which had received a slight injury. After advising him as to its treatment, we entered into conversation with him. He warned us that in spite of the apparent cleanliness of our lodging, he knew for certain that there were bugs in it, but on questioning him further, it appeared that his only reason for saying so was that he had seen one 3 years ago. Nevertheless, he advised us to take 2 precautions which he assured us would protect us from injury. Firstly, to keep a candle burning all night. Secondly, to take a small quantity of the spirit called arak just before going to bed. We neglected the first of these measures, but not the second, and whether owing to this or to the absence of the malas, we slept untroubled by the noxious insects which have given to Miyanet so evil a reputation. Our road next day led us towards the imposing-looking mass of the Qaflan Kuh. A tortuous path brought us to the summit of the pass, whence we again descended to the river, which we crossed by a fine bridge. On the other side of this bridge we were met by a man who besought us to help him in recovering his horse from the soldiers at an adjacent guardhouse, who had, as he alleged, forcibly and wrongfully taken it from him. We accordingly went with him to the guardhouse and endeavoured to ascertain the truth of the matter, and, if possible, effect a satisfactory settlement. In answer to our inquiries, the soldiers informed us that they had reason to suspect that the horse had been stolen, as it was too valuable an animal to be the lawful property of the man in whose possession they had found it. They added that if he desired to recover it, he must go to Miyanet and obtain a paper from some respectable citizen to certify that the horse really belonged to him, when it would be restored to him. With this explanation and promise, we were compelled to be satisfied, and proceeded on our way till we reached another pass. On crossing this, we entered on an immense flat tableland, the surface of which was thrown into conical mounds resembling gigantic ant-hills, and thinly covered with mountain plants which perfumed the air with their fragrance. The ground was riddled with the holes of what appeared to be a kind of jerboa. These little animals were very fearless, and allowed us to approach quite close to them before they retreated into their burrows. About 4 p.m. we reached the compact and almost treeless village of Sarkham, where we halted for the night. Just before reaching it, we came up with one of those caravans of the dead, so graphically described by Vambery. The coffins, which differ in some degree from those used in Europe, the upper end being flat instead of convex, and furnished with 2 short handles like a wheelbarrow, were sewn up in sacking, to which was affixed a paper label bearing the name of the deceased. Each animal in this dismal caravan was laden with 2 or 3 coffins, on the top of which was mounted, in some cases, a man or woman, related probably to one of the deceased, whose bodies were on their way to their last resting place in the sacred precincts of Qum. We had no difficulty in getting lodgings at Sarkham, for the place contains an extraordinary number of caravanserais, considering its small size, and the inhabitants vied with each other in offering hospitality. Next day, Saturday, 12th of November, we started early, being given to understand that a long stage lay before us. All day we followed the course of the river, which is a tributary of the Kizil Uzan, though here it seems to be known by the name of the Zanjan Ob. Dense fogs obscured the sun in the earlier part of the day, but these rolled away as the heat increased, leaving a cloudless sky. The air was perfumed with the scent of the plant which we had observed on the preceding day. On our march we passed 3 immense caravans, consisting respectively of 102, 72, and 39 camels, bearing merchandise to Tabriz. There is, to my mind, an indescribable dignity about the camel, who seems to eye one scornfully with a half-turned head as he passes majestically on his way, and the sight of a string of these animals was one of which I never grew weary. On the road we saw a serpent, as well as numbers of lizards, and a small tortoise, which our muleteers called spargha, a word which I have never heard elsewhere, and which seems to be purely local. About 3 p.m. we reached the village of Nikhbeg, where we halted. It is a squalid-looking place, devoid of trees, and only remarkable for a very fine old caravanserai of the Safavi period, which bears an inscription over the gateway to the effect that it was repaired by order of Shah Safi, who alighted here on his return from the successful siege of the fortress of Erivan. While copying this inscription, we were surprised and pleased to perceive the approach of Mr. Whipple, the American missionary, who was posting from Tabriz to Hamadan to visit his fellow workers there. Our next stage brought us to the considerable town of Zanjan, so celebrated for its obstinate defence by the Bahá'ís against the royal troops in the year 1850. It lies in a plain surrounded by hills, and is situated near, but not on, the river called Zanjan Ab, which is at this point surrounded by gardens. The town has never recovered from the effects of the siege, for, besides the injury which it sustained from the cannonade to which it was exposed for several months, a considerable portion was burnt by the besieged on one occasion, when they were hard pressed by the enemy, to create a diversion. We entered the town by the western gate, passing on our left an extensive cemetery, of which two blue-domed Imamzades constitute the most conspicuous feature. We alighted at a caravanserai near the bazaar, which we visited shortly after our arrival. It is not very extensive, being limited to one long street running east and west more than half through the town, which is much longer in this direction than from north to south. The great drawback to Zanjan is the enormous number of beggars who throng its streets and importune the traveller for alms with cries of Allah Najat versin, Allah Najat versin, may God give you salvation. In this respect it is unrivalled, so far as I have seen, by any town in Persia, with the exception of Kirman, and even there, though the poverty of the mendicant classes is probably greater, their importunity is far less. In the evening we received a visit from a very rascally looking Teherani with a frightful squint, who inquired if we had any arak, and on learning that we had, requested permission to introduce some companions of his who were waiting outside. These presently appeared, and having done full justice to the arak, which they finished off, suggested that we might perhaps like to hear a song. Without waiting for an answer, one of them broke forth into the most discordant strains, shouting the end of each verse, which struck him as peculiarly touching, into the ear of the man who sat next him, who received it with a drunken simper and a languid Bali, yes, as though it had been a question addressed to him. When this entertainment had come to an end, the eyes of our visitors fell on my pocket flask, which they began to admire, saying, "This bottle is very good and admirably adapted for the pocket, but we have already given enough trouble." As I affected not to understand the purport of their remarks, they presently departed, to our great satisfaction. From the difficulty which the squint-eyed man seemed to experience in getting his feet into his shoes, I fancied that our arak was not the first which he had tasted that night. End of section 7.